She walked until her feet bled into the earth, until every step became a prayer, until the very soil of America absorbed her pain. And still, she walked. Before we begin this journey together, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this one. Stories of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit that changed the course of history. The year was 1857, and a woman named Delilah stood at the edge of a cotton field in southern Mississippi, staring north toward a freedom she could barely imagine. She was 28 years old, though the lines around her eyes told the story of someone who had lived twice that long. Her hands, calloused and scarred from years of forced labor, trembled slightly as she clutched a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Inside was everything she owned in this world: a tin cup, a piece of cornbread she had saved from her ration, and a scrap of paper with a single word written on it by a traveling preacher who had taken pity on her years ago. The word was Virginia. That scrap of paper had become her North Star, her promise, her reason to believe that somewhere beyond the endless fields of cotton and cruelty, there existed a place where she might breathe as a free woman. Delilah had been born into bondage on the Hutchinson plantation, a sprawling estate where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, where children were torn from their mothers' arms, where every sunrise brought fresh humiliation, and every sunset carried the weight of another day survived. She had known no other life. Her mother, Sarah, had died when Delilah was 12, her body simply giving out after years of back-breaking work and systematic brutality. Her father had been sold away when she was just 5 years old, and she barely remembered his face. Only the sound of his voice singing hymns in the evening, a sound that had haunted her dreams for 23 years. But something had changed in Delilah over the past year. Perhaps it was the news that had filtered through the underground networks of enslaved people, whispered stories of others who had made the journey north and found freedom. Perhaps it was the day she had witnessed Master Hutchinson sell her cousin Samuel to a plantation in Alabama, watching as the wagon carried him away while his wife Ruth screamed until her voice gave out. Or perhaps it was simply that she had reached a point where the risk of dying on the road to freedom seemed preferable to dying slowly in chains. Whatever the catalyst, Delilah had made her decision. She would walk to Northern Virginia, to a place she had heard about in hushed conversations, where sympathetic people, both black and white, were helping fugitives reach true freedom in the North. 600 miles, on foot, alone. Would she make it past the first night? Would the patrollers catch her before dawn? The plan had taken months to prepare. Delilah was not impulsive. She was methodical, intelligent, patient. She had learned to read by watching the Hutchinson children through the schoolroom window while she worked in the main house, memorizing the shapes of letters, sounding out words in her mind. She had studied the stars by night, teaching herself to recognize the constellations that would guide her north. She had observed the patterns of the patrollers who roamed the roads looking for runaways, noting when they changed shifts, where they were lazy, where they were vigilant. She had cultivated relationships with other enslaved people on neighboring plantations, building a network of trust, gathering information about safe places to hide, about which white people might be sympathetic, about which rivers could be crossed and which were too dangerous. She had also prepared herself mentally and spiritually. Every night for 6 months she had prayed, not the prayers that Master Hutchinson's preacher had taught them, the ones about obedience and accepting their lot in life, but prayers that came from somewhere deeper, from the ancestral memory that connected her to people who had once been free in a land across the ocean. She prayed to her mother and her grandmother and all the women who had come before her, women whose names she would never know, but whose strength she could feel in her bones. She prayed for courage, for endurance, for the wisdom to know when to hide and when to run, when to trust and when to flee. And she prayed that if she died on this journey, it would be as a woman who had chosen her own path, not as property. The night she left was moonless, which was both a blessing and a curse. The darkness would hide her, but it would also make the journey more treacherous. Delilah waited until well past midnight, when even the most dedicated overseers were asleep, when the only sounds were the crickets and the distant howl of dogs. She slipped out of the slave quarters barefoot. She had no shoes, had never owned shoes, wearing the only dress she possessed, a rough garment made of Osnaburg cloth that chafed against her skin. She moved like a shadow, keeping low, avoiding the paths, staying close to the tree line. How many steps would it take to cover 600 miles? How many would she take before her body gave out? The first 3 nights were a blur of terror and determination. Delilah walked only in darkness, hiding during the day in whatever shelter she could find. Hollowed-out logs, dense thickets of underbrush, abandoned outbuildings on the edges of farms. She drank from streams and ate the cornbread she had brought, rationing it carefully, knowing it would have to last. Her feet, unaccustomed to the rough terrain, began to bleed almost immediately. The roads were a mix of dirt, gravel, and exposed roots. Every step sent shooting pain through her legs, but she pushed forward, whispering to herself, "One more step. Just one more step." On the 4th day, hiding in a grove of trees near a small creek, Delilah heard the sound she had been dreading. Dogs. The patrollers had discovered her absence and were hunting her. The baying of the hounds sent ice through her veins, but she did not panic. She had prepared for this. She waded into the creek, letting the water wash away her scent, and followed it upstream for nearly a mile, her feet numb from the cold. When she finally climbed out, she was miles off her original course. But she was alive. She lay in the mud beneath a fallen tree, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst, and waited. The dogs passed within 50 yards of her hiding spot, their handlers cursing and shouting, but they did not find her. When the sounds faded, Delilah allowed herself to breathe. That night, as she resumed her journey, she thought about what it meant to be hunted like an animal. She thought about the society that had created laws declaring her to be property, that had built an entire economy on the forced labor of people who looked like her. She thought about Master Hutchinson and his wife, who attended church every Sunday and sang hymns about God's love, yet saw no contradiction in owning human beings. She thought about the children on the plantation, black children who would grow up knowing only bondage, who would have their spirits broken before they reached adulthood. And she thought about the white children, who would grow up believing that such cruelty was natural and right, their souls twisted by the poison of supremacy. Could she really make it 600 miles? What if she was caught? What horrors awaited a captured runaway? By the end of the first week, Delilah had covered approximately 60 miles. Her feet were a mass of blisters and cuts, her dress was torn and filthy, and she had not eaten anything but wild berries and roots for 3 days. But she was still free, still moving north, still alive. She had learned to read the land, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated human presence, the smell of wood smoke, the distant sound of a dog barking, the way birds scattered when people were near. She had learned to move silently, to become part of the landscape, to disappear. One evening, as dusk was falling and she was preparing to begin her night's walk, Delilah encountered another human being for the first time since leaving the plantation. An elderly black man was working in a small garden behind a ramshackle cabin. He looked up and saw her, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. Delilah was poised to run, but something in his eyes stopped her. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then gestured for her to come closer. His name was Moses, he told her in a whisper, and yes, he was enslaved, but his master was old and half-blind and rarely ventured out to check on him. He gave her a piece of salt pork, a handful of dried corn, and a rag to wrap around her bleeding feet. He also gave her information. There was a Quaker family about 30 miles north who were known to help runaways. Look for a house with a red door and a large oak tree in the front yard. Go there after dark. Knock 3 times, wait, then knock twice more. Delilah wanted to thank him. to embrace him, to tell him that his kindness had restored something in her that she thought had been lost. But words seemed inadequate. Instead, she simply nodded, and he nodded back, and in that silent exchange passed an entire history of shared suffering and shared resistance. As she disappeared back into the woods, she heard him begin to sing, a low, mournful spiritual that followed her into the darkness. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Would she find the house with the red door? Could she trust these strangers with her life? The journey to the Quaker house took her 4 more days. Delilah's feet were now so damaged that every step left bloody footprints in her wake. She walked in a kind of trance, her mind detaching from her body, floating somewhere above the pain. She recited everything she could remember, the prayers her mother had taught her, the songs from the quarters, the names of people she had loved and lost. She talked to her mother, carrying on long conversations with a ghost, asking for guidance, for strength, for a sign that she was on the right path. When she finally found the house, red door, oak tree, just as Moses had described, it was well past midnight. Delilah stood in the shadows for a long time, watching, making sure it was safe. Then, her heart hammering in her chest, she approached the door and knocked. 3 times. Pause. Twice more. The door opened almost immediately, and a white woman with kind eyes and lines of worry on her face ushered her inside. "Quickly, child. Quickly," the woman whispered. Her name was Rachel, and her husband was Thomas, and they were indeed Quakers who had committed themselves to helping freedom seekers. They took Delilah to a hidden room in their cellar, gave her water and bread and cheese, and tended to her feet with gentle hands and homemade salves. Rachel wept when she saw the extent of Delilah's injuries. "How far have you come?" she asked. "From Mississippi," Delilah replied, and Rachel's eyes widened. "Mississippi? That's at least 100 miles already." "I'm going to Northern Virginia," Delilah said quietly. "I have 500 more to go." Thomas and Rachel exchanged glances, and Delilah saw something like awe in their expressions. "You're incredibly brave," Rachel said. Delilah shook her head. "Not brave, just done with dying slow." Could she stay here? Could she build a life in this place? Or would the pull of true freedom always haunt her? Delilah stayed with Thomas and Rachel for 5 days, allowing her feet to heal enough for travel. They wanted her to stay longer, but she was restless, anxious. Every day she remained in one place was a day she could be discovered. The patrollers and slave catchers were relentless, and the network of those who hunted runaways extended far beyond plantation boundaries. There were bounty hunters who made their living tracking down fugitives, men who were skilled and ruthless and motivated by profit. Delilah knew that her description had been circulated, that people were looking for her, that the longer she stayed anywhere, the greater the risk. During those 5 days, Rachel taught Delilah more about the geography ahead. She gave her a crude map, drawn on cloth that could be hidden easily, showing rivers, towns, and safe houses along the route north. She taught her about the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and brave conductors who were helping thousands of people escape bondage. She told her about Harriet Tubman, a woman who had escaped slavery herself and had returned to the South repeatedly to lead others to freedom. "If she can do it," Rachel said, "so can you." Delilah absorbed every piece of information like a sponge, committing everything to memory, knowing that knowledge was survival. Thomas gave her a pair of old boots that had belonged to their son. They were too large, but Delilah stuffed them with rags and wore them gratefully. He also gave her a small knife for protection and for cutting food. "I pray you never have to use it for anything else," he said quietly. Delilah understood what he meant. The world beyond this safe house was hostile and violent, especially for a black woman traveling alone. She thanked them with tears in her eyes, and when she left on the 6th night, she carried with her not just supplies, but something even more precious: hope. What new dangers awaited her on the road ahead? Would her luck hold, or was she walking toward her doom? The next phase of Delilah's journey took her through Tennessee, a landscape of rolling hills and dense forests. She was moving deeper into spring now, and the weather was warming, which made travel easier but also meant there were more people on the roads, more chances of being seen. She continued to travel at night, but now she had the advantage of the map and the knowledge of where safe houses might be found. Not all of them were still safe. Some had been compromised, their occupants arrested or intimidated into silence. But enough remained that Delilah was able to find shelter and aid every few days. She met others along the way, fellow travelers on this dangerous road to freedom. There was a young man named Isaac who had escaped from a plantation in Alabama, his back a map of scars from countless whippings. There was a woman named Esther, traveling with her 2 young children, moving at an agonizingly slow pace but refusing to leave them behind. There was an old man named Benjamin, who had been enslaved for 70 years and had decided he would rather die trying to be free than spend his last days in chains. These encounters were brief, usually just a night or two sheltering in the same hiding place, but they formed a bond that transcended words. They were all walking the same path, all risking everything for the same dream. Delilah found strength in these encounters. She was not alone. Her struggle was not singular. It was part of a vast, unspoken resistance, a movement of people who refused to accept the inhuman conditions imposed upon them, who insisted on their right to autonomy and dignity. Every person she met reinforced her determination. If they could keep going, so could she. How many more miles? How many more nights of walking through the darkness, never knowing if dawn would bring freedom or capture? By the time Delilah crossed into Virginia, she had been traveling for 6 weeks. She had lost weight, her body burning through whatever resources it had in the relentless demand of the journey. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, and her face had taken on a gaunt, haunted quality. But her eyes burned with an intensity that had not been there when she left Mississippi. She was changed, transformed by the journey, hardened and strengthened in ways she could not fully articulate. Virginia was both closer to her goal and more dangerous. This was a slave state, but it was also where many of the routes to the north converged, which meant it was heavily patrolled. Slave catchers operated with impunity here, and the penalties for helping fugitives were severe. Delilah moved with extreme caution, trusting no one until she had clear confirmation they were part of the network. One night, while hiding in a barn on the outskirts of a small town, Delilah was nearly discovered by a patroller making his rounds. She pressed herself into the shadows, behind a stack of hay bales, holding her breath, the knife Thomas had given her clutched in her hand. The patroller entered the barn with a lantern, moving slowly, methodically, checking every corner. He came within 3 feet of where she hid. Delilah could see his face in the lantern light, young, bored, doing a job he probably found tedious. If he found her, she would have to make a choice, surrender and face certain torture and possibly death, or fight. She tightened her grip on the knife, her entire body coiled like a spring. But then the patroller yawned, decided the barn was empty, and left. Delilah remained frozen for another hour, waiting to be sure he was truly gone before allowing herself to collapse, shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror. This was the moment, poised between capture and continued flight. How much longer could her luck possibly hold? It was during this phase of the journey that Delilah experienced what she would later think of as her moment of spiritual reckoning. She had been walking for nearly 2 months, covering approximately 400 miles, and she was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Her soul was weary. One night, in a moment of despair, she sat down beside a river and contemplated simply giving up. The water rushed past, dark and inviting, and she thought about how easy it would be to walk into that river and let it carry her away. She thought about her mother, about Sarah's weary eyes and broken body, and she wondered if perhaps some battles simply could not be won. "Mama," she whispered into the darkness, "I don't know if I can do this. I'm so tired. I'm so tired of being afraid, of being hunted, of every moment being a struggle just to survive. Tell me what to do." And then something extraordinary happened. Delilah felt a presence, as real as if someone had sat down beside her. She felt warmth despite the cool night air, and she heard, not with her ears, but with something deeper, a voice that said, "You are not just walking for yourself. You are walking for all of us. Every step you take is an act of defiance against those who tried to break us. Every mile you cover is a mile toward reclaiming what was stolen. Don't you dare stop now." Delilah wept then, great heaving sobs that came from a place of profound grief and profound strength intermingled. She wept for her mother, and for herself, for every person still in bondage, for the children being born into slavery at that very moment. And when her tears were spent, she stood up, wiped her face, and continued walking. The moment of crisis had passed. She was renewed. She had faced her darkest moment and emerged stronger, but the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. The final 200 miles to northern Virginia were a test of everything Delilah had learned. The landscape became more populated, which meant more opportunities for help, but also more dangers. She passed through towns where slave auctions were held, where she saw human beings standing on blocks being examined and sold like cattle. She saw families being separated, children crying, mothers screaming. Each scene reinforced why she was doing this, why the risk was worth it. Better to die trying than to live as property. She also witnessed acts of resistance that filled her with pride. She saw enslaved people engaged in subtle forms of sabotage, working slowly, breaking tools accidentally, feigning illness. She heard stories of revolts, of people who had fought back against their oppressors even knowing it meant certain death. She learned about Nat Turner, about the 1831 rebellion that had sent shockwaves through the South, about the fierce desire for freedom that could not be stamped out no matter how brutal the repression. Delilah met a conductor on the Underground Railroad named William, a free black man who had devoted his life to helping others escape. William operated with remarkable skill and courage, moving fugitives through Virginia with a network that was both sophisticated and constantly evolving. "The key," he told Delilah, "is to be smarter than them. They think we're inferior, that we're incapable of complex thought. We use that prejudice against them. We hide in plain sight. We adapt. We survive." Would William be able to guide her to safety? Or would this be where her journey ended in capture and return to bondage? William helped Delilah cover the next 50 miles, introducing her to safe houses, teaching her new techniques for avoiding detection. He taught her how to forge documents if necessary, how to pose as a free servant if questioned, how to read the subtle signs that indicated danger. Under his guidance, Delilah felt her confidence growing. She was no longer just surviving. She was navigating this hostile landscape with skill and intelligence. But the final stretch was something she had to do alone. William could only take her so far before he needed to return south to help others. "You're almost there," he told her as they parted ways. "Northern Virginia near Alexandria, there's a community of free black people and sympathetic whites. Find your way there, and you'll be as safe as anywhere in the South can be. From there, you can plan the final journey to the north if you choose." He clasped her hand firmly, looking her straight in the eye. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Delilah. You've already accomplished something remarkable. Finish this journey. Live free." The final 100 miles were a blur of determination and exhaustion. Delilah's body was failing, pushed far beyond what should have been possible. The boots Thomas had given her were falling apart, and her feet were once again bleeding. She developed a fever at one point, her body fighting some infection, but she pushed through it, walking in a delirium, her mind wandering between past and present, between memory and dream. She saw her mother walking beside her, encouraging her. She saw her father, the face she barely remembered, smiling at her with pride. She saw all the ancestors, a long line of people stretching back through time, all of them walking with her, their strength flowing through her veins. She was so close now, but her body was giving out. Would she make it, or would she collapse mere miles from her destination? And then, one morning, as the sun rose over the Virginia hills, Delilah crested a rise and saw in the distance a town. Alexandria. She had made it. 600 miles, on foot, mostly barefoot, alone. She had walked from Mississippi to northern Virginia, through territory where she was hunted, through conditions that would have broken most people. But she had survived. She had made it. Delilah sank to her knees on that hilltop, not from exhaustion but from overwhelming emotion. She raised her face to the morning sun and felt its warmth, and for the first time in her life, that warmth felt like a promise rather than a threat. She thought about Master Hutchinson, about the plantation she had left behind, about the system that had tried to define her as less than human, and she smiled. Because they had failed. She was here, she was alive, and she was free, or at least freer than she had ever been. The journey wasn't over, of course. Delilah would spend several months in the Alexandria area, working, saving money, preparing for the final journey to the north. She would eventually make it to Philadelphia, where she would build a new life, where she would work as a seamstress and become active in the abolitionist movement, telling her story to anyone who would listen, bearing witness to the horrors of slavery and the possibility of resistance. She would live to see the Civil War, to see the Emancipation Proclamation, to see the day when slavery was officially abolished. She would live to be 73 years old, and she would never forget the journey that had changed her life. But on that morning, kneeling on a hilltop in Virginia, none of that future was visible. There was only the present moment, the culmination of 600 miles and 8 weeks of walking, of bleeding feet and constant fear, of determination and hope. There was only the sunrise and the knowledge that she had done the impossible. Delilah descended the hill and entered the town. She found the community William had told her about, and she was welcomed with open arms, with tears and embraces, with people who understood what she had accomplished because they had made similar journeys themselves or had helped others make them. They tended to her wounds, fed her, gave her a place to sleep. And that night, for the first time since she had left Mississippi, Delilah slept without fear. Without the need to wake at every sound, without the constant vigilance that had kept her alive but had also kept her from truly resting. She dreamed that night of walking, but in her dream she was not fleeing. She was simply moving forward, one step at a time, through a landscape that was beautiful and open and full of possibility. And when she woke in the morning, she knew that the dream was not just fantasy. It was a vision of the life she would now build for herself, step by step, with the same determination that had carried her 600 miles. Reflection on a journey of spirit and survival. Delilah's story is not just about physical endurance. Though her walk of 600 miles barefoot stands as a testament to human resilience, it is about the refusal to accept dehumanization, about the insistence on one's own worth and dignity in the face of a system designed to deny both. Every step she took was an act of revolution, a rejection of the narrative that said she was property, that said she had no right to control her own destiny. We must understand that Delilah was not unusual. There were thousands of Delilahs, thousands of people who made similar journeys, who risked everything for freedom, who demonstrated extraordinary intelligence, courage, and determination. The narrative of enslavement often focuses on the brutality inflicted, and that brutality was real and horrific. But we must also tell the stories of resistance, of the people who never accepted their bondage. who found ways to maintain their humanity and their hope, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The enslaved people of America were not passive victims. They were active agents in their own liberation. They created networks of resistance and mutual aid. They preserved their cultures and their dignity. They sabotaged the system that oppressed them in countless small and large ways. They ran for freedom despite knowing that capture meant torture or death. They were brilliant strategists, skilled navigators, courageous freedom fighters. They were fully human in all their complexity, capable of fear and courage, despair and hope, weakness and extraordinary strength. And what of the society that created and maintained such a system? What do we say about the men and women who saw human beings as property, who built fortunes on forced labor, who separated families and inflicted unspeakable cruelties, and who did all of this while considering themselves civilized and Christian? The institution of slavery corrupted everyone it touched, most of all those who benefited from it. The enslaved people maintained their humanity in the face of dehumanization. The enslavers lost theirs in the act of dehumanizing others. Delilah's journey reminds us that freedom is not given. It is taken, it is fought for. It is walked toward one painful step at a time. Her bleeding feet marked a path that thousands would follow, each one adding their own story to the great narrative of liberation. The Underground Railroad, the resistance movements, the rebellions, the daily acts of defiance. All of these were part of a long struggle for dignity and autonomy that continues in different forms to this day. We honor Delilah and the countless others like her not with pity, but with recognition of their agency and their strength. We honor them by telling their stories truthfully, by acknowledging both the horrors they faced and the brilliance with which they resisted. We honor them by understanding that the freedom we enjoy today was built on their sacrifice, their courage, their refusal to be broken. The earth absorbed Delilah's blood as she walked those 600 miles. Every footstep was a prayer, every mile a testimony. And though her name may not appear in history books, though her story might have been lost if not for the few records and memories that survived, she was there. She walked. She survived. She lived free. And in doing so, she helped to break the chains not just for herself, but for all who would come after. Let us remember that freedom has always been a journey, not a destination. Let us remember that every step toward justice and dignity matters. Let us remember the ancestors who walked impossible distances, who endured unimaginable hardships, who never stopped believing that a better world was possible. Their blood is in our veins. Their strength is our inheritance. Their dreams are our responsibility. Delilah walked 600 miles barefoot, so that we might walk forward unburdened. The least we can do is remember her journey, honor her courage, and continue the work of building the world she envisioned. A world where every person is recognized as fully human, where dignity is universal, where freedom is not a privilege but a birthright. That is the promise of her journey. That is the legacy of her bleeding feet, marking a path through American soil. That is what we owe to her memory and to the memory of all who walked that long, hard road to freedom.